right, welcome to our next unit in human biology. So we just left the nervous tissue unit, which turned out to be a pretty difficult unit in my class. I don't know how the other classes fared. But now we're moving on to chapter 7. I haven't opened the textbook that much, but I guess it's chapter 7, and that's going to be central nervous system. So we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. So right now, hopefully you're watching this and it's before the test, because in the nervous tissue test, or unit, I noticed a lot of my students, they didn't watch the Ed Puzzle lectures until after the test. Well, it's kind of too late then. So hopefully this is before the test in our central nervous system. And our learning objective for the day, learning objective number 1. You're going to describe what's called a reflex arc and the basic components that make up a reflex arc. So basically the neurons, which makes up a reflex arc. So that's, you kind of know what reflexes are. So if somebody throws something at you and you, boom, you instantly catch it, or you're able to dodge like punches or something, like, wow, you have really good reflexes. So that's what we're going to be going over in today's lesson. Okay, so what is a reflex? It is rapid. It happens very fast. It's predictable, so it happens. It's consistent. So if you tap somebody on the, just below their patella and their knee right there, it makes them think the patellar reflex and makes them kick their leg. You've probably had that at the doctor where they hit you with that little hammer, that little rubber hammer. It's involuntary, so it happens all by itself. You don't have to think about doing these reflexes, and it's the responses to various stimuli. Now, why are they important? Well, in many cases, it diminishes damage that may occur. So here's a picture of a reflex arc down here. So there's 5 components that make up a reflex arc. So first you have the receptor. It's gonna detect the stimulus, whatever's happening in the body or outside the body. It's gonna detect that. The sensory neuron. So the receptor is attached to the sensory neuron. It's going to send that signal. It's going to fire an action potential. So when the receptor feels the stimulus, it's going to cause that sensory neuron to fire an action potential. And it's going to take that information, the action potential, towards the central nervous system to the integration center. And that's located right here inside the spinal cord. And then from the integration center, an interneuron, it's going to go to a motor neuron. And then finally, the motor neuron is going to send an action potential down, and it's going to innervate or connect to some sort of effector to make whatever response is necessary in a response to that stimuli. And here's a little diagram that shows the 5 basic elements of a reflex arc. So it starts right here with our stimulus. In this case, it looks like a nail or a pin that's poking our skin, poking our epidermis right here, and just below that you have the dermis. And we have our receptor. We have a receptor. It looks like free nerve endings. Remember, those detect pain. Sometimes they can detect temperature. So this little pin is stimulating this receptor. It's allowing either sodium or calcium ions to start coming in. And if enough calcium or sodium ions come in to reach negative 55 millivolts, boom, this sensory neuron is going to fire an action potential. And it's going to send this action potential, this nerve impulse, towards the central nervous system, towards the spinal cord. Now, it's not going to be just one sensory neuron doing this. It's going to be a bundle of them. It's going to be a nerve. And you can see right here, here's the neuron cell body. So there's going to be a bunch of cell bodies right here. So this right here, I don't know if you remember from nervous tissue, this right here is going to be a cluster of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system, outside the brain and spinal cord. So this right here is called a ganglion. Remember, a cluster of neuron cell bodies outside of the CNS is called a ganglion. And this is the back. This is the back of the spinal cord right here. This is the front. So this is the dorsal. This is ventral. Remember, dorsal is towards the back. Ventral is towards the stomach. So this is coming in through what's called the dorsal route or dorsal root. And this right here, this cluster of neuron cell bodies is going to be called the dorsal root ganglion. I just noticed an old term right here, or old from this semester. The stimulus is at the distal end of a neuron. I don't know if you'll need to know this, but remember, distal in Unit 1 was the appendages. So further away from the point of attachment is distal and closer to the point of attachment is proximal. So over here, the receptor, that's at the distal end of the neuron because it's further away from the central nervous system. And over here, towards the dorsal root ganglion, and where it starts to come into the spinal cord, that's going to be the proximal end of the neuron. But anyways, all right, so you can see this sensory neuron is going to innervate or connect with an interneuron, this gray one right here. And that's the integration center. Integration center inside the central nervous system. Usually the integration center, you're thinking of the brain. But in reflexes, it's going to be the spinal cord. And this is what's going to be called a polysynaptic neuron. Let me go ahead and type that over here. This is going to be a polysynaptic reflex. Polysynaptic Polysynaptic reflex, and the reason why that is, it's pretty obvious. You can see there's a synapse right here, a synapse between the sensory neuron and the interneuron, and there's a second synapse right here between the interneuron and what's going to be the motor neuron right here. There's also some reflexes are monosynaptic. So that's where the sensory neuron is going to innervate or connect with directly with the motor neuron. So there's going to be no interneuron in a monosynaptic reflex. But this is polysynaptic, so it's going to be a little slower than a monosynaptic because it does have to, the neurotransmitters do have to cross the synaptic cleft, excite this interneuron, and the interneuron's got to fire the action potential. Then the neurotransmitter's got to cross this synaptic cleft, and then fire an action potential from the motor neuron. So it's going to be slightly slower than a monosynaptic reflex. So number 3 is the integration center, which in this case is an interneuron. And the number 4, of course, is going to be the motor neuron, efferent, because it's leaving the central nervous system. It's going to fire an action potential. It's going to travel down through the axon, and it's going to innervate or connect with some sort of effector. In this case, it looks like some sort of skeletal muscle. And the effector is what's going to make the desired response, may make you pull your hand back from something's hot or something like that. So this is the 5 basic elements of a reflex arc. And it's basically the same as the last slide, except in words and no picture. All right, so remember, number 1 of the reflex arc is the sensory receptor. So that's at the dendrite end or the dendritic end of a neuron that can respond to a specific type of stimulus. So that could be pain, pressure, thermoreceptors that detect cold and heat, etc. And then the sensory receptor is a part, it's connected with the sensory neuron. So it's basically the dendrites of a sensory neuron. So that's the type of neuron that senses information and it's going to carry that impulse, that action potential, to the axon terminals in gray matter. Oh, I should have said that on the previous slide. Maybe I'll go back to it. Of the CNS. So the sensory neuron is going to fire an action potential. It's going to carry the information to your spinal cord. From there, it's going to connect with an interneuron inside your spinal cord. That's the integrating center. So the synapse between the sensory and motor neuron. So there's an interneuron between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So there's usually one or more interneurons. In simple reflex, it's a direct sensory to motor synapse. And remember, that is called, if it's direct sensory neuron, direct to the motor neuron with no interneuron in between, that reflex is going to be called a monosynaptic reflex. And if there is one or more interneurons in between the sensory and motor neurons, remember that's called polysynaptic because there's more than one synapse. Monosynaptic means one synapse, monosynaptic. And then after the interneuron is going to stimulate the motor neuron. Efferent neuron is going to take the signal from the central nervous system, from the spinal cord, and it's going to send that information to a muscle or gland. And that is that's the effector. So that's the part of the body that's going to respond to the stimulus. So if you touch something hot, it's going to go afferent neuron to your spinal cord, interneuron, motor neuron is going to cause the response in my muscle to pull my hand away. So that is your reflex arc components. I wanted to come back to this slide real fast because I forgot to show something that's about the spinal cord here. So it's a transverse cut of the spinal cord. So it's cutting the spinal cord into a superior and inferior sections, or top and bottoms, cutting it right in half like that. All right, so right here you can see this dark region. This is the gray matter. It looks brown on this picture, but in real life it appears gray. So, and out here you have the white matter. So here's white matter. It's white because it's full of myelinated axons. Myelin is made of mostly fat or lipids, and lipids or fat appear white. So these are out here, these are tracks. So these are axons that are going up to the brain or coming down from the brain into the body. So these are tracks going to the brain or from the brain. But in here, the gray matter, you can see, look, here's a cell body right here. Here's another cell body right here. So this right here appears gray because it's full of neuron cell bodies or possibly unmyelinated axons. And remember, the white matter appears white because it's full of myelinated axons. And not a whole lot on this slide. So these are called somatic reflexes. So if you remember from last unit, the somatic nervous system, that's your skeletal muscles, that's voluntary control. Well, this is kind of the same because it does involve your skeletal muscles, but this is going to be involuntary. So your reflexes is skeletal muscle, but it's going to be involuntary because this is going to minimize potential damage. So for example, if you touch something hot, maybe a hot stove or fire or whatever, that information, instead of it having to travel to your spinal cord through a sensory neuron, then up your spinal cord to your brain, then your brain says, whoa, that's hot. And then it makes a decision, pull your hand away, and it goes back down your spinal cord. Eventually, efferent motor neuron to your hand, and it pulls it away. Well, by then your hand might be, severely burned. So a reflex, the sensory neuron goes to your spinal cord, possibly to an interneuron, then directly to a motor neuron to the effector to get your hand back before that information even reaches the brain. Now, your spinal cord is going to send that information to your brain. So you are going to know that that was hot, and you're going to know that you did pull your hand away, but it's going to happen before you realize it. So this helps to minimize potential damage so your body can respond to something very, very quickly. All right, here's a specific type of somatic reflex, reflexes with your skeletal muscle. In this case, it's the patellar reflex or knee jerk reflex. So, right here, this is your patellar tendon right here. And when we get to the skeletal system, this is your patella or your kneecap. So, the doctor, if you've had a physical for sports, if you're an athlete, you've probably had this done. It's going to hit you with this little reflex hammer right there on your patellar tendon. It's going to cause your quadricep muscle to become stretched. And that's going to be detected by a stretch receptor right there in your quadricep muscle. So when that thing gets stimulated, it's going to fire an action potential through this sensory neuron. It's going to hit, here we go. Here's the dorsal root ganglion right here. You can see it's a bulging in the nerve right there. It swells, gets a little bigger because this is a cluster of neuron cell bodies. And it's going to enter the spinal cord through the dorsal route through the back. So here it comes into the gray matter. Here's the gray matter, this little butterfly looking shape right here. This is neuron cell bodies and maybe unmyelinated axons. Out here we have the white matter, myelinated axons. And look, it goes directly from sensory neuron, here's the synapse, to motor neuron. So this is going to be a monosynaptic reflex because there's two neurons, but there's only one synapse. Monosynaptic, one synapse. So the synapse with the motor neuron, it creates an action potential, goes out through the ventral route, out of the spinal cord, through the front, and then down, and it's going to innervate or connect to the effector. In this case, it's a skeletal muscle, and it's going to cause your quadricep muscles to contract, which causes your foot to lightly kick. I mean, you don't really kick, but just a little bit of a kick. So that's your patellar reflex. And very similar to the last slide, there's another specific type of somatic reflex, the withdrawal or flexor reflex. All right, so here you can see this time the stimulus is not a little reflex hammer hitting your patellar tendon. This is where you're touching something, looks like a little tack or something. So your sensory receptor is going to feel that. The sensory neuron is going to take it through the dorsal route. Here's the dorsal root ganglion right here. Comes into the spinal cord, enters the gray area. But this time it's going to connect with an interneuron. So it's going to be three neurons. 1, 2, 3. So the sensory neuron innervates or connects with this interneuron. Remember, that's the integration center. And it's going to innervate or connect with a motor neuron. And it's going to make this motor neuron find an action potential, which is going to travel down to the effector. In this case, it looks like the biceps brachii muscle in your upper arm. And that's going to cause your hand to withdraw. So the neuron spinal reflex, in which a limb is withdrawn from a painful stimulus. For example, touching something hot or prickly. And remember, this is to reduce injury because that information doesn't have to go all the way up to the brain. The brain figures out, hey, that thing's sharp. Maybe I should bring my arm back. And then the brain's like, yes, bring your arm back. And then that information has to come all the way back down. Well, that's too long. By now, you could be seriously injured. So this response is made right here in the spinal cord. It bypasses the brain. So anyways, also because remember, this is a polysynaptic reflex because there's more than one synapse because there's one right there and then there's two right there. There's three neurons and two synapses. So it's polysynaptic where the other one was monosynaptic with just one synapse. And because there's three neurons and two synapses, it's going to be a little bit slower than a two neuron reflex or a monosynaptic reflex. All right, so just like we had the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, we have somatic reflexes and we also have autonomic reflexes. So these are not going to control skeletal muscle. They're going to regulate the activity of smooth muscles, the heart, and glands. So some specific examples are the salivary reflex, the pupillary reflex. So if you walk into a dark room, the pupils of your eyes are going to dilate. They're going to get bigger to allow more light to come in. Now, if someone shines a flashlight in your eye, your pupils are going to constrict, get smaller to make less light enter your eye. your heart and blood pressure, swallowing, coughing, digesting. So the movement of food through your digestive tract, your gastrointestinal tract, is controlled by smooth muscle movements, and that's autonomic reflexes. And the salivary reflex is something like this. If you think of a lemon, and if you think of just biting into a lemon, just the thought of it sometimes will make your mouth salivate. So just think of biting into a lemon. Just the thought of biting into a sour lemon like that makes your mouth water. And our last type of reflex is conditioned or learned reflexes. All right, so conditioner reflexes are responses that have become automatic over time due to training with a stimulus. So over here we have the classic example of what's called Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov, a scientist, he did some experiments, and it's called classical conditioning. So first he has this dog, and the unconditioned stimulus. This is a natural stimulus, dog food. It made the dog his mouth water, because he sees the food, he smells the food, and his mouth starts to salivate. Then you have a neutral stimulus, in this case, some sort of auditory that looks like a whistle, where that doesn't make any response in the dog because it doesn't mean anything to the dog. But then he paired them together. So he paired the auditory stimulus with the dog food, the scent and the sight, the vision of the dog food. So now he starts to salivate. He's salivating because of the dog food, but he also paired this neutral stimulus with it. And over time, through training, even without the dog food, if he blew the whistle, it caused the dog to salivate. And some other examples include driving. Now, most of you guys are 16, 17. So when you're driving, you're probably still 10 and 2 and looking around and stopping completely at a stop sign. And, you're really focused on what's going on. But once you've been driving for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I come to school and I don't even remember driving to school because it's kind of it's a conditioned reflex. I've done it thousands of times. I don't even have to think about it. Here's Pavlov's dogs over here, what I said, the salivation, starting blocks. So track runners, ready, set, pew, and the gun goes off. Boom. Those guys are conditioned. They're conditioned when they hear that sound. Boom, they're gone. So they can react to the sound of that starter pistol a lot faster than just some that guy or girl that never practices it. And hopefully the school bell. So the school bell, you hear that school bell, and boom, you start walking to class. That's the way it's supposed to go. So those are all conditioned reflexes. And the last slide, why do doctors test reflexes? Well, it evaluates the condition of the nervous system. So if a reflex is exaggerated, so it's more than it should be, distorted, it's not exactly, the type of reflex it should be, or if it's absent, it doesn't happen at all, it could mean damage or disease. Now, usually if the reflex is less than or it's doesn't happen at all, that usually signifies, or it's like an indicator of damage to your motor neurons in your peripheral nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord. And if it's exaggerated, usually it's an indication that there's damage or disease inside the central nervous system. All right, so here you remember this was the patellar reflex where he's going to hit the patellar tendon, causing his quadricep muscle to contract, and he's going to do a little kick. Here's the plantar reflex. Remember, plantar is the bottom of the foot. It's going to cause the toes to curl down. And here's the brachial reflex, the biceps brachii reflex. So he's going to hit the little hammer on top of his thumb. And it's going to cause his biceps to contract, which is going to make his arm come up. All right, so these are all different types of reflexes. I hope you enjoyed lecture number 1, and I'll see you for lecture number 2.